The story begins in a small village in Ukraine, where we are shown a small house. A couple lives in this house, living their lives happily. The man living in this house is named Mykola, and his wife's name is Nastia. Nastia was a drawing artist who made various statues by carving wood. Mykola is a teacher and teaches math to children at a nearby school. He is a very good teacher, and all the children are quite happy with him, except for one named Evan. Evan was a very rude boy. Every day in class he would harass his teacher Mykola. Evan belonged to a rich family while Mykola was a poor man. Therefore, Evan would mock Mykola's looks and clothes. He wanted Mykola to get fed up with his rudeness and raise a hand against him so that he could complain and get Mykola kicked out of the school. But Mykola was a very calm person. He didn't care about Evan's words and remained happy in his own life. Because there were no electronic items like a TV in Mykola's house, he couldn't get news of the world. One day while Mykola was at his school, he heard news on the TV that Russia had attacked Ukraine, in which many soldiers were killed and Russia had captured many places in Ukraine. In the evening when Mykola came home, he found out that his wife was pregnant. He was very happy to know this because Mykola was now going to become a father. Together they both celebrated this happiness. The next day, Mykola bid farewell to his wife and set off on his bicycle toward the school. While on his way he spotted two soldiers standing by the road lighting cigarettes. They were wearing uniforms he didn't recognize. They certainly weren't Ukrainian, which struck him as odd. However, Mykola brushed it off, thinking perhaps the government had changed the military attire, and hurried to school. When he arrived, he found the entire school deserted. Not a single child had shown up. Sensing something was terribly wrong, he turned on the TV to see a news report announcing that Russian soldiers had crossed the border to seize Ukraine. It hit him instantly. The soldiers he saw on the road were Russians. Overcome with fear for his pregnant wife who was home alone, he hopped on his bicycle and raced back. But he was too late. When Mykola reached his home, he found the two soldiers brutally beating his wife. He tried to intervene, but the soldiers overpowered and thrashed him as well. Mykola desperately pleaded, "Please don't hit my wife, she's pregnant." But the soldiers remained heartless and continued their assault. After searching the house and finding nothing of value, one soldier set the house on fire in a fit of rage. As they prepared to leave, Nastia, seeing her home in flames, snapped. She grabbed a stone and threw it at the Russian soldiers. In response, one of the soldiers opened fire, killing Nastia instantly. The ground slipped from beneath Mykola's feet as he watched his wife fall. He crawled to her, took her in his arms and wept uncontrollably. A few hours later, two Ukrainian soldiers arrived. Seeing the tragedy, they felt deep remorse and tried to console Mykola, telling him not to lose heart. They helped dig a grave and told Mykola to bury his wife. Mykola was completely shattered. He was now entirely alone. Those soldiers hadn't just killed his wife, they had murdered his unborn child and turned his life to ashes. Burning with a desire for vengeance, Mykola knew he had to kill the soldier who fired the shot. The only way to get his revenge was to join the fight. He begged the two Ukrainian soldiers, "Please take me with you. I want to join the Ukrainian army." The soldiers agreed and took him to their military base. Before leaving the ruins of his life, Mykola picked up a small wooden statue carved by his wife, a charm she had made for his protection. When they arrived at the military base, the commanding officer was furious with the two soldiers for bringing a civilian. He initially refused to enlist Mykola, suspecting he might be a spy. However, after the soldiers vouched for him and Mykola recounted the horrific story of how the Russians had brutally murdered his wife and torched his home, the officer's stance softened. Mykola made it clear. He had nothing left to live for and wanted only to liberate his country and avenge his family. Moved by his resolve, the senior officer agreed to let him join. Training began the very next day, but as an ordinary man who had spent his life teaching mathematics, Mykola struggled immensely. He knew nothing about firearms. While the other recruits were lightning fast at assembling their rifles, Mykola was painstakingly slow, always finishing last. Watching him, the officer feared that Mykola would never make it as a soldier. Yet, Mykola refused to quit, maintaining a razor-sharp focus on his training. One night, Mykola told his senior that he no longer wanted to be called by his name. He wanted his code name to be Raven. The other soldiers burst into laughter, and the officer explained that a code name isn't just chosen. It's earned through great feats on the battlefield. Mykola didn't take the mockery to heart. Instead, it fueled him to work even harder. While the other soldiers slept, Mykola stayed up practicing and refining his skills. One day, the senior officer announced to the troop that they were desperately short on snipers and needed to increase their numbers to counter the Russian forces. When he asked for volunteers, a few men stood up, including Mykola. The sight of Mykola volunteering drew more laughter from the ranks. The officer looked at him and said, "You aren't ready to be a sniper. You can barely assemble and disassemble a standard rifle, let alone master a sniper's precision." Mykola looked him in the eye and replied, "I can be a great sniper. I just need one chance to prove myself." The officer challenged him, "Fine. Assemble this rifle in under 20 seconds. To everyone's shock, Mykola took out a blindfold and tied it tightly over his eyes. With his sense of touch guided by mathematical precision, he stripped the gun and reassembled it in a staggering 18 seconds. The room went silent. The men who had been laughing moments ago began to applaud. Impressed by his incredible speed and intuition, the senior officer officially inducted him into the sniper training program. During training, Mykola was handed an outdated old-model rifle, while the other recruits were given modern weapons. When Mykola requested a modern rifle, the senior officer told him that if he wanted the better gear, he would have to prove his worth first. Left with no other choice, Mykola took the old rifle and headed out. The instructor explained to the recruits that no matter the situation, a sniper must never flinch or move even an inch from their position while locked onto a target. To test this, the officer began firing live rounds near the recruits. Anyone who flinched or broke position was immediately disqualified. When it was Mykola's turn, he remained as still as a statue, keeping his sights fixed despite the chaos around him. He passed the test with ease. In the next stage of training, the snipers were shown their target only once before their vision was blocked by a blackboard. They had to rely on memory and estimation to take the shot. While some soldiers managed to pass, Mykola's shot missed by a fraction and he failed the test. Everyone realized that the fault lay with his antique rifle, which lacked the precision required for such a shot. Had he been using a modern weapon, he surely would have hit the mark. The final challenge was the most difficult. Snipers had to hit a target in total darkness, illuminated only by the brief glow of a flare. The officer launched a flare, and the recruits scrambled to fire, but none of them could hit the target. Amidst the gunfire, Mykola was the only one who didn't pull the trigger. He realized that hitting a target directly in the flickering light of a flare was nearly impossible. Instead of firing blindly, he used the brief flash of the flare to calculate the exact distance and trajectory using his mathematical expertise. Once he had the coordinates mapped in his mind, he fired a perfect shot. The senior officer and the other soldiers were stunned. No one had ever completed this task before. Deeply impressed, the senior officer finally granted him his desired code name, Raven. As the days passed, Mykola poured his heart and soul into his training. Finally, the day of the results arrived. The colonel himself saluted Mykola, announcing that he had officially passed the test and was now an elite sniper. A few days later, the colonel approached Mykola and told him to pack his gear. They were heading out on a mission. Intelligence had reported that Russian soldiers had seized a checkpoint. This was where the real story began. Mykola's team reached the location swiftly, took up their positions and locked onto their targets. Just as they were about to open fire, a vehicle appeared in the distance, heading toward the checkpoint. The colonel ordered everyone to hold their fire. The Russian soldiers stopped the vehicle and ordered the occupants to step out. They checked their passports and searched the entire car. Once they found nothing suspicious, they gave the civilians permission to leave, but kept their passports. When the civilians pleaded for their documents back, the soldiers began beating them brutally. Seeing this, the colonel gave the order to fire. In a single, synchronized volley, the snipers took down every target. Their first mission was a success. When they returned to the base, Mykola noticed that many of his comrades were missing. Worried, he asked where everyone was, only to be told they had been sent on a different mission. The next day, devastating news arrived. Most of the soldiers on that mission had been killed. They had been hunted down by a legendary Russian sniper named Sergei, widely considered Russia's finest marksman. A few days passed, and Mykola set out with his remaining teammates for their next mission. Upon reaching the location, they planted landmines all around and took their hidden positions. Soon, a squad of Russian soldiers arrived, and among them was Evan. Evan was the same arrogant boy who used to harass Mykola in school. He had now joined the Russian forces. When the colonel gave the order to shoot, Mykola hesitated for a moment, gripped by the conflict of killing his former student. However, pushing his emotions aside, Mykola aimed not at the boy, but at the planted landmines. He pulled the trigger, triggering a massive explosion that wiped out the entire Russian squad, including Evan. Once the area was secured, the colonel, visibly angry, demanded to know what Mykola had been thinking when he hesitated after the order to fire. Mikola replied heavily, "One of those soldiers was my student. I didn't want to be the one to kill him." The colonel looked at him sternly and explained that he shouldn't feel a shred of guilt for Evan's death. "In this place he wasn't your student, he was your enemy," the colonel said. "Joining the Russian army was Evan's own choice. You don't need to feel bad for him." After completing the mission, they returned to the base camp. The colonel had developed complete trust in Mikola and spent most of his time with him. One evening, the colonel showed Mikola a photo of his family, sharing that he had 2 daughters who had no idea their father was a soldier. "I've told them I'm a businessman," he admitted, "and my wife has kept my secret all these years." In return, Mikola shared the agonizing story of how the Russian soldiers had brutally murdered his wife. He became overwhelmed with emotion, but the colonel offered him the strength to carry on. The next morning they set out on a critical mission. Intelligence suggested a group of Russian soldiers would be passing through a specific route. The colonel and Mikola reached the location early and entrenched themselves in their positions. After a tense wait, 2 Russian soldiers appeared, scouting ahead for the rest of their team. Suddenly Mikola froze. Through his scope he recognized one of the soldiers. It was the man who had shot his wife. The killer was right in his crosshairs. Mikola urgently whispered for permission to fire, but the colonel refused, ordering him to wait for the rest of the squad. Mikola was seeing red. The man who destroyed his life was standing right there. He had joined the army for this exact moment. He begged for permission to fire a second time, but the colonel denied him again. Driven by raw grief and fury, Mikola could no longer control his emotions. He pulled the trigger. The soldier dropped dead instantly, but the silence of the mission was shattered. Their position was now exposed. The colonel hissed, "What have you done?" But the situation was far worse than they realized. Sergei, Russia's most lethal sniper, was already in position nearby, and now he knew exactly where they were hiding. The colonel knew that Sergei was nearby and began scanning the area to locate him. But before he could pinpoint the position, Sergei fired a perfect headshot. The colonel died instantly. It was only then that Mikola realized the gravity of his mistake. His impulsiveness had cost the life of his mentor. Within moments, the Russian soldiers began a heavy barrage of gunfire and shelling on Mikola's position. Seeing the situation spiral out of control, Mikola decided to retreat. He shouldered the colonel's body and fought his way back until he was clear of the enemy zone and reached the base. Mikola was consumed by guilt, holding himself entirely responsible for the colonel's death. Over the body of his fallen leader, he swore a solemn oath. He would hunt down Sergei and avenge the colonel. Soon after, Mikola received intelligence regarding 2 Russian snipers and immediately set out on a solo mission. He reached the location and took his position. He managed to take down the first sniper, but as he did, the second sniper opened fire, wounding Mikola in the arm. Despite the searing pain, he didn't give up. He readjusted his aim and neutralized the second threat as well. Badly injured and bleeding, he retreated to a secret safe house to tend to his wounds and recover. While recovering, he received a call from the army major, who informed him that they had finally tracked down the sniper who killed the colonel. Mikola returned to the base, where the major briefed the team on their target. The major explained that the sniper's name was Sergei, Russia's most elite marksman. He had never missed a shot. "Sergei has already eliminated 6 of Ukraine's most capable snipers," the major warned. "He is not to be taken lightly." He further revealed Sergei's psychological warfare tactics. He would kill Ukrainian soldiers and then upload videos of the kills to social media to shatter the army's morale. Interestingly, the major noted that Sergei was a creature of habit. He rarely changed his position and preferred to hunt his enemies from a specific, fixed location. The team devised a strategic plan to infiltrate Sergei's location using 2 separate units. According to the plan, the first team would launch a frontal assault to distract the Russian soldiers. While the enemy was occupied, the second team would flank them from behind. This diversion would provide Mikola the window he needed to slip into the building and eliminate Sergei. With the strategy finalized, they headed toward the target. Upon arrival, the snipers took their positions and waited. Mikola stealthily entered the building, where he encountered 2 Russian soldiers deep in conversation. Without a moment's hesitation, he neutralized them and pushed further inside. Once in position, he signaled his team. On his command, the hidden Ukrainian snipers opened fire, wiping out the soldiers stationed outside. Meanwhile, Sergei noticed that none of his men were reporting in. Sensing something was wrong, he rushed to the rooftop where another Russian sniper was stationed. To his horror, he found the sniper dead. Panic began to set in as Sergei realized he was surrounded. He contacted his base for backup, but he was told it would take 10 minutes for help to arrive. He scrambled back to his post to scan for the Ukrainians. Suddenly he spotted a small wooden statue sitting on a table. Before Serhiy could react, Mykola lunged from the shadows. A brutal hand-to-hand struggle ensued, and Mykola ended Serhiy's life with his own hands. The commotion alerted another sniper nearby, but before the soldier could raise his weapon, Mykola tossed a grenade, ending the threat in a massive blast. Moments later, Serhiy's backup team arrived in a truck, unaware that their ace sniper was dead. When they tried to radio Serhiy, it was Mykola who answered. "You are all about to die," he said coldly before sniping the truck driver. As the truck swerved, the Russian soldiers scrambled out, only to find themselves in the crosshairs of the waiting Ukrainian team. One by one the Russians were picked off until none remained. A few days after the mission, Mykola visited his wife's grave. The promise he made to her was finally fulfilled. The men who took her life and the colonel's life were gone. Standing over her resting place, Mykola vowed to serve his country until his last breath. Having found his purpose in the silence of the scope, he walked away. And with that the film ends.